On September 12, 1984, the president of Paramount Pictures, a 42-year-old executive named Michael Eisner, resigned from his position. He had been offered a new role at another notable entertainment company. What would be acknowledged today as the highest level at the most prominent media giant in the world, the CEO of the Walt Disney Company, at the time, was equivalent to the position of a captain on a sinking ship. Disney, for a multitude of reasons, was failing, and the company had just fended off a vicious takeover attempt a few months prior. The sinking ship elected Eisner as its new captain, but Eisner had no plans to sail on until it was submerged. He had much bigger ideas. He was going to dismantle the ship and build it again. In that spirit, he set to work revitalizing every aspect of the company. This included Disney's theme parks, namely Disneyland. The park had not had a major addition since 1979's Big Thunder Mountain Railroad, and 5 years after its debut, attendance was reflecting the lack of new attractions. There were various passion projects floating around in wet enterprises, mainly Discovery Bay, an ambitious expansion that was still on the drawing board and had stalled in progress. The lack of direction resulted in the park's attendance dropping nearly 20% in 4 years, going from 11.5 million people in 1980 to just 9.8 million people in 1984. With no new attractions on the way to boost attendance, the solution was fairly clear: produce more rides. But this would be one of the first times in Eisner's reign that he would demand those working for him go beyond the obvious answer. The solution wasn't just to build more attractions, but to build more exciting and thrilling rides. Attractions less like 1983's Pinocchio's Daring Journey, and more like Big Thunder Mountain. This meant that Eisner would be going after an entirely different demographic for the park. In the CEO's mind, Disneyland would always attract young children and by extension their parents. But what they couldn't attract is everyone in between. Being a family man himself, he wanted rides that someone like his teenage son, Breck, could enjoy. After taking a trip to Disneyland with his son, it was clear that the park had little to offer him. Wasting no time, Eisner began planting the seeds for thrilling attractions such as Star Tours and Splash Mountain. Eisner expected these rides to be built within a year or two, but he was displeased to hear that the production on attractions like the ones he was encouraging would take much longer. With Disneyland's attendance continuing to fall, he needed something much faster to drive in the young adult and teenage crowd. A guaranteed, quick, and cheap way to bring the youth of Southern California into Disneyland. Lucky for him, it was the 80s. The 1980s saw a revitalization on American culture's fascination with youth and the teenage experience. Unlike the sock hops of the 50s, which encapsulated the spirit of a generation, the teens of the 1980s had a rougher edge to them, with innocence having a shorter lifespan as many of the antiquated values of society changed. This change was best reflected in the period's music, and the birth of music television or MTV, with more mature music finding its way into the mainstream. At the same time, more parents entered the workforce and divorce rates skyrocketed. With no infrastructure to accommodate these changes, the youth of the decade was pushed outside of their parents' watchful eye and into a new world catering to the adolescent. The generational experience was the subject of countless coming-of-age films, and companies took notice of a seemingly new demographic to market toward. Theme parks especially saw the opportunity to attract the generation with an abundance of independence and free time. While thrill rides were appealing to teens, there wasn't any cheaper or easier way to bring in the youth of the day, later dubbed the MTV generation, than with music. Knott's Berry Farm in Buena Park, California, Disneyland's local rival, had opened the largest teenage nightclub in Southern California, Studio K, in early 1984, and along with the Cloud9 Ballroom, the new dance spot had been attracting the area's youth in droves. This was the exact type of attraction Disney needed while they continued work on Eisner's elaborate modern e-tickets. Of course, Disney denied Studio K or Cloud9 having any influence on their plans for a teenage nightclub, insisting that it was a mere coincidence. In early 1985, Steve Carroll, the manager of Disneyland Show and Operations, sat at a Chinese restaurant, brainstorming ideas to fulfill Eisner's decree. He flipped over the placemat in front of him, jotting down an idea for a teen nightclub at Disneyland. The club was to be called Galaxy, and it would take the place of the Tomorrowland Space Stage, which was currently showing the 3D film Magic Journeys. Carroll thought the space could be better used as a sci-fi dance area for teens and young adults. Unfortunately, the space was earmarked for one of Eisner's young adult attractions, a new 3D film starring Michael Jackson named Captain EO. This would transform the outdoor space stage into an indoor 4D theater. Despite the roadblock, the idea of a teenage nightclub was well received, probably because there was already a proven model right down the street, but regardless, it was the perfect project to begin the revitalization of the parks. Carroll and his team got to work developing a nightclub for teens. In order to set the venue apart from the others in the area, the team designed the most high-tech club that they could realistically build, relying on techniques typically used in large concerts rather than simple discotheques. The club was to be named Videopolis, and it would utilize over 70 screens, 2 large screens on either side of the main stage, with an array of smaller screens making up a mosaic throughout the rest of the stage. These would display the many popular music videos of the day that the teens could view as they danced. The venue, which was to be 5,000 square feet, would also include seating for 1,500. This would allow Videopolis to show stage plays or host special events during the day and then transform into a high-tech dance club at night. The club was to have elaborate stage lighting and special effects, such as light sticks that projected simple images in a way that made them appear 3D. Development on Videopolis began on February 14, 1985, and construction took place throughout the spring. A site in North Fantasyland, an unused meadow near It's a Small World, was chosen for the construction site. This area would be a perfect place for Videopolis for a few reasons. One, it was at the very back of the park, so the music and teens would be separated from the rest of Disneyland's operations. Another positive was that its location was right next to the launch site for the nighttime fireworks show. This meant that when the fireworks were set off, they would explode directly above the dance floor. The only drawback to the location was that Videopolis would be in Fantasyland. With its modern design and emphasis on technology, Carol was right that it would have been a better fit for Tomorrowland. But then again, this was at a time when Tomorrowland had the patriotic, nostalgia-based show, America Sings. It was a very weird time. The development and construction of Videopolis was one of the most efficient Disneyland builds in the park's history, and at the time, it was said to be the quickest from development to opening. It was labeled as the 100-day miracle, as it took 100 days from the first developmental meeting to opening day, although some Disney press releases stated that it actually took 128 days. Videopolis cost $3 million to build, and to save money, used assets left over from the 1984 Los Angeles Olympic Games. On Saturday, June 22, 1985, Videopolis opened its doors to the 14 to 21-year-olds of Disneyland. 15 technicians, 3 rotating disc jockeys, and a cover band named Donna McDaniel and Network entertained the young adults throughout the night. A snack bar called Yums acted as the club's concession stand. Jim Lohman, a cast member working in food and beverages, was assigned the task of finding food items for Videopolis. While Yums would serve basic concessions, such as popcorn and nachos, Lohman would add one notable item, a 12-inch churro. 2 churro carts would be placed in Videopolis, and the snack would eventually spread throughout Disneyland, becoming a staple of Disney parks. There would also be a merchandise stand, a decorated pickup truck that sold Videopolis T-shirts and other merchandise. Videopolis even had its own theme song.
Going to the top, Videopolis, gonna make it drop, Videopolis, Videopolis.
In its first few months of operation, Videopolis became the subject of national news. In September of 1980, 2 gay men were dancing together at the Tomorrowland Terrace dance floor. Security guards, enforcing the park's ban on same-sex dancing, ejected them from the park. The men then sued Disneyland on grounds of discrimination. Disneyland claimed that they had had the rule since 1957, when the park officially allowed dancing. From 1955 to 1957, it can be assumed dancing was outlawed in Disneyland. After they decided to legalize and regulate the act of dancing in their park, Disneyland put a strict ban on same-sex dancing. The 2 men violated this act in 1980, when they engaged in what was referred to as homosexual fast dancing. The reason for the rule was apparently because Disney was looking out for the safety of park guests, saying, quote, "We didn't want to have 2 women dancing and have some guy go out and hassle them." They also said it was a crowd control measure, and that if same-sex couples, platonic or not, were allowed to dance together, it would result in a larger, unsafe crowd. They also admitted that they were a family park that thought the, quote, alternative lifestyles would offend their guests, but it was mainly the safety thing. On June 29, 1984, an Orange County judge ordered Disneyland to allow the 2 men to dance, as denying them their right to dance would violate California's business discrimination policies. This was a huge win for the 2 men and no one else, because Disney claimed that all the court determined was that those 2 specific men should be allowed to dance, and if any other same-sex couples wished to participate in the party, they should lawyer up. Disneyland's lawyers said, quote, "We'll abide by the order, but it doesn't apply to others. If 2 other men show up tomorrow night to dance, Disneyland won't let them on the dance floor." The lawyer of the 2 men seemingly agreed with Disney's interpretation, also admitting that this didn't mean that any same-sex couple could dance, just this specific one. When Videopolis opened in the summer of 1985, many teens requested that Disney lift their ban on same-sex dancing. Disney obliged, and it became a huge news story, with Videopolis at the center of it. Gay rights activists cheered the decision, believing that it was a huge step forward for Disney. Disney shut that down pretty fast, saying, quote, "Videopolis brings in a lot of teenaged kids, and we see a lot of situations where 2 girls come together and want to dance and ask to. We have always said no, but we changed our minds." Then they doubled down on their interpretation of the 1984 ruling, saying, quote, "Although we lost that, we only lost on removing those 2 men from the dancing area. We continue to enforce the policy until a month ago." Disney spun the lift on same-sex dancing as a necessary evil, because many teenagers are shy toward the opposite sex, so they might feel more comfortable dancing with a group of their friends, essentially shifting blame to the young adults' fears of their own heterosexuality rather than the park's own fear of homosexuality. A 15-year-old, Dominique, said on the subject, quote, "It's just as fun to dance with your friends as it is with a guy. We go dancing together a lot. There's nothing wrong with it." Completely missing the point, by design. Despite all of the semantics, homosexual fast dancing was finally allowed at Disneyland. Homosexual slow dancing was another story. With the first round of Videotes, the name given to the teens visiting Videopolis, having experienced the club, reviews were coming in, and the consensus was that it was tubular. 18-year-old George said, quote, "The videos are sure hot and the live band is really great." 14-year-old Chris said, quote, "My friends are here. The lights are really weird." 15-year-old Shannon was more critical in her review, saying, quote, "They need some slow dances." 16-year-old Robert praised the new edition, explaining, quote, "I like the females here. There are lots of females." Throughout 1985, Videopolis attracted a group of regulars, and the venue seemed to be a huge success. When 18-year-old Fleur de Lis was asked whether she would rather ride Space Mountain or go to Videopolis, she scoffed, quote, "You can't dance on Space Mountain." In the summer of 1986, 17-year-old Gina said, quote, "I even broke my leg here running to the dance floor exactly a year ago today and spent New Year's here in a wheelchair." Despite the positive reviews from the teens, there were many outspoken critics of Videopolis and Disneyland's efforts to appeal to teenagers and young adults. Many came from worried parents who thought the new club would bring in a more rowdy crowd to a traditionally kid-oriented park. Others were concerned about the possibility of gang violence, which had been on the rise and had become a major focus of the media. The sudden growth in the use and distribution of crack cocaine, among other factors, led to a rapid rise in youth gangs and gang violence in the 1980s, and Southern California was at the epicenter of the growth. Typical gang members were between 14 and 20 years old, coincidentally also the target demographic for the youth discotheques and nightclubs that were popping up throughout the city. This led to issues as the youth gangs would claim certain nightclubs as part of their turf, and Knott's Berry Farm and Disneyland were not exempt. In July of 1985, weeks after Videopolis opened, Knott's Berry Farm's nightclubs were involved in a prominent altercation. Rival gangs encountered one another at Studio K and Cloud 9, and after leaving the park, a brawl involving 50 teenagers broke out. One Knott's employee had his facial bone shattered while trying to stop the fight. This was just a month after a grad night party at Six Flags Magic Mountain in Valencia ended with 21 gang members being arrested after 6 people were stabbed. Disneyland responded to these concerns by assuring guests that, as per their dress code, gang members visiting the park would have to remove their colors, and that their security detail would be put through police training to better assist if an altercation were to happen. Still, whether it was genuine concern or plain paranoia, many felt it was only a matter of time before a tragedy would occur at the park. Disney knew this was a concern going in, and on top of increasing security and supervision, they also implemented a series of decisions that, whether on purpose or not, helped keep the perceived rougher crowd of teens away. While one of Videopolis' main features was its showcasing of popular music videos, the technical director overseeing the club would make sure to cut away when any of the videos displayed inappropriate images by Disney standards. Cameras were placed throughout the club and would periodically show the teens dancing on the big screen, especially when an inappropriate section of a music video was coming up. They also avoided playing many of the controversial songs of the day. While this helped appease the minds of parents and keep the atmosphere Disney, it also made Videopolis uncool in the minds of the Southern California youth, especially compared to the more relaxed atmosphere of Studio K and Cloud 9 at Knott's. Another factor in splitting the Disneyland Knott's audience was Disney's pricing plan. A Videopolis pass was created, allowing teenagers admission to the park after 5 p.m. during the summer for $40, or around $95 today adjusted for inflation. This was a good deal when compared to the season pass at the time, which cost $85 or around $200 when adjusted for inflation. Knott's, on the other hand, charged teens $8 after 6 p.m. to encourage attendance at their nightclubs. While the Videopolis pass would be a better deal in the long run, the lump sum approach resulted in the less fortunate kids heading to Knott's. Without a per-night ticket, if a teen wanted to go to Videopolis without the pass, it would cost them $15 for the adult passport, double the special ticket offered by Knott's. This resulted in a class divide between Disneyland's Videopolis and Knott's Berry Farm's Studio K and Cloud 9. The former would be looked at as the overly clean, whitewashed club for privileged kids, while the latter would be seen as a more diverse and hip hangout spot. This was the view from the eyes of the youth of the Los Angeles area, but from the eyes of Disneyland and its typical guests, Videopolis was far from the safe, family-friendly atmosphere guests expected from the park. Videopolis was essentially hookup central, and the North Fantasyland bathrooms were later cited as a prime hangout spot. Security was tight at Videopolis, but they seemed to be more focused on the dance floor. Conga lines were off limits at the club, and that rule was strictly enforced. For some reason, though, security had no problem with allowing the occasional older guest to join the teens. 61-year-old Suzanne DiMuccio became known by the regulars as Dancing Mama. She visited the club almost every night. When asked why, she explained, quote, "The kids love me. I come every week and dance all night long. It keeps me young." While many of the less-than-Mickey happenings at Videopolis were expected, one of the fears that parkgoers and parents had from its inception was tragically realized. Around 1 a.m. on March 8, 1987, two gangs of teenagers got into an altercation in the Disneyland parking lot after the park's closing. The two groups engaged in a fistfight before an 18-year-old pulled a gun and shot a 15-year-old boy 3 to 4 times in the back. Another 14-year-old boy, uninvolved in the fight, was hit by a stray bullet. Both victims were rushed to the hospital. The 14-year-old suffered minor injuries, but tragically, the 15-year-old died. Hours later, the murderer was arrested. It was Disneyland's second homicide, with the first taking place 6 years earlier when an 18-year-old was stabbed to death in Tomorrowland. Videopolis was blamed for attracting the gangs that led to the fight, although a direct connection was never reported. It was off-season for Videopolis at the time of the shooting, and unlike the summer, where every night was a non-stop dance party, Videopolis only acted as a dance club on Saturdays and some Sundays in the spring of 1987. The altercation took place after a Friday night at Disneyland, when Videopolis was not operating as a club. Still, Videopolis and the effort to bring in more teens to the park were believed to be the reasons for the gangs gravitating toward Disneyland, although the entire situation could simply be a coincidence. Videopolis continued operation without change, even expanding its reach throughout the Walt Disney Company. In 1987, the Videopolis Cafe, a second nightclub for teens, was announced as part of a new nightclub district named Pleasure Island, planned for the Disney Village Marketplace at the Walt Disney World Resort in Orlando, Florida. On top of this, a television show based off of Videopolis was created for Disney Channel, premiering in 1987. The show was described as American Bandstand for Kids, and featured host Randy Hamilton accompanied by a dancing crew of Videopolis regulars, including a young Mario Lopez. The show would see famous musical acts come by, including New Kids on the Block, Janet Jackson, and the Jets. This of course meant that the kids would have to interact with the big stars, and it was painful.
Oh, wait a minute, Patrick. Weren't you going to offer Pebbles a guided tour of Videopolis? Sure. Especially the dance floor part?
Yeah, sure.
Just in case we lost you, Pebbles, Patrick wants to dance with you. Is that all right?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Let's go.
The show would last until 1989, and a monthly show called Videopolis Star Tracks, which would follow musicians on and off stage, would air from 1987 to 1990. The 1987 and 1988 Disneyland State Fairs would use the Videopolis stage as a BMX course, and a show featuring Goofy and the BMX group The Wizards of Rad was performed. In late 1987, Disneyland hosted a fundraiser to benefit the AIDS Project Los Angeles, resulting in thousands of gay people being openly invited into the Magic Kingdom. Many believe that Disney was doing this to distract from their past behavior, such as banning homosexual fast dancing, and Disney agreed, saying they were hosting it to, quote, dismiss finally all that nonsense that happened in the past. Hilariously and sadly, around the same time, 3 gay UCLA students dancing at Disneyland were told by a security guard that they were not allowed to slow dance. They sued Disneyland for their right to engage in homosexual slow dancing, or as the security guard referred to it, touch dancing. The 3 settled out of court, with Disney admitting that the security guard violated their anti-discrimination policy. Finally, both homosexual fast dancing and homosexual slow dancing were allowed at the happiest place on Earth. In the summer of 1988, a railroad station was added near Videopolis, named the Videopolis Station, allowing those riding the Disneyland Railroad to hop off at Fantasyland. By this point, Videopolis was hosting night events for all ages, with some press reports promoting Videopolis as an all-ages dance floor, possibly to calm the rowdy teenage crowd. In the summer of 1989, the Videopolis Cafe, renamed to Videopolis East, opened with the Pleasure Island nightclub district. The only non-adult club in the complex, Videopolis East boasted over 170 screens and an interactive game where computers allowed guests to control the lights and effects in the club. Videopolis East was the only club on Pleasure Island to not serve alcohol, and it was open nightly from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. In early November 1989, Disneyland announced that they were going to close Videopolis to make way for a musical stage show tribute to the works of Walt Disney, entitled One Man's Dream. The show, which had premiered the year prior in Tokyo Disneyland, was to celebrate the park's 35th anniversary. Disneyland management said that Videopolis might return after the show's run, but they were still deciding on its future. In the meantime, they told teens that they could join the rest of park-goers for an all-ages dance party at the Tomorrowland Terrace dance floor. The regulars took this as the end of their favorite hangout spot, and the Vidiotes were right. Videopolis would close on November 26, 1989, and never reopen for teens. the stage would continue to use the name Videopolis and would still sport its exceptionally 80s design, but only family shows would occupy the stage. Disney's official reason was to repurpose the space, but many speculated whether the gang incident and other issues with the teenagers contributed to the decision. It is still unclear what the exact reason for Videopolis' closure was, but it does seem slightly suspicious that the sole reason for its closure was the addition of One Man's Dream, as the space had hosted 4 different stage shows and countless special events in its 4.5 years of operation. It is also possible that One Man's Dream was more elaborate than the other shows, and the stage and seating area was altered to accommodate it, no longer making the dance club possible at night while the show was performing. Some speculated that low attendance at Videopolis toward the end of its run was another factor in its closure. While Videopolis was closing, Studio K and Cloud 9 were expanding, but the party wouldn't last much longer than Videopolis. Knott's Cool Teen Hangouts would close in 1991, just 2 years after Videopolis shut its doors. Videopolis East would continue to operate despite Videopolis' closure, but within Pleasure Island's first year of operation, Videopolis East was replaced with Cage, a nightclub for those over 18 or children accompanied by an adult. Videopolis East, like its West Coast counterpart, had attracted a consistent group of teenagers visiting the club, and unfortunately, also like its West Coast counterpart, had led to fights. In Videopolis East's case, a fight between 27 teenagers that led to 2 boys being stabbed. Disney denied that the replacement of the club was prompted by the violence. In 1992, another venue named Videopolis would open in Disneyland at Euro Disneyland in France. While it was rumored to also be a nightclub for youth before its debut, it would end up as simply a large theater for stage shows. Very interesting stage shows. Videopolis in Anaheim would host 4 additional shows after One Man's Dream, before the theater would be refurbished into the Fantasyland Theater in 1995. In 1993, the Videopolis train station had been renamed and rethemed to the Mickey's Toontown Train Depot with the Toontown expansion. The Fantasyland Theater is still operating today, currently showing the stage show Mickey and the Magical Map, as it has been for over 6 years.
We're gonna take you all the way back to 1985 and kick it off with Videopolis Dancer!
Videopolis did live to see one more day, on January 29, 2020, when the Fantasyland Theater was transformed back into the nightclub for the Disneyland After Dark 80s Night event. The event even included a choreographed dance to the club's rocking theme. Perhaps Videopolis was destined to die before the start of the 90s. It was a concept born specifically from the teenage culture of the 80s, and it died with the decade. Videopolis, despite its many controversies, was a huge success, drawing in thousands of teens on popular nights, and it, along with Eisner's other attractions, resulted in Disneyland's attendance reaching a high of 13 million in both 1987 and 1988, a 30% increase since Eisner took over. Videopolis is fondly remembered by its regular videos. Many lifelong friendships and even marriages began at Videopolis, and the MTV generation of the area still thinks of the teenage hangouts as the embodiment of the 80s, whether they were dancing at Studio K and Cloud 9 or going to the top at Videopolis.